Hello everybody, today I want to talk about a short comic series called Wonder Woman Historia, The Amazons. This is a series of 3 comic books written by Kelly Sue DeConnick and lavishly illustrated by Phil Jimenez, Jean Ha, and Nicola Scott, in that order. This series is part of DC's Black Label imprint, a collection of prestige format miniseries, possibly best known for Batman Damned. Now, Wonder Woman Historia reimagines the origin of DC's Amazons, a group of warrior women inspired by the mythical Amazons from ancient Greek art and literature. As such, it's a work of classical reception, a piece of media that receives or responds to ancient Mediterranean art, myth, and culture. Now, there's a lot that I like about this series, and a lot that I can't stand, but rather than just sit here and complain about the comic stylistic choices or its narrative weaknesses, I want to examine how this comic engages with the historical realities of misogyny in the ancient world, and how it presents a sincere, if ultimately flawed, sort of feminist intervention on the Wonder Woman mythos. So, this video will be my first foray into the wider discussion of Wonder Woman as classical reception, but I'm sure it will not be the last. Let's start by walking through the plot and themes of this comic. So, the most famous DC Amazon is, of course, Wonder Woman, but Diana actually does not figure prominently in this comic. Instead, Historia focuses on the earliest Amazons themselves, their creation at the hands of the Greek goddesses, the actions that lead to their exile on Themyscira, and most importantly, the ascension of their queen, Hippolyta. The title Historia comes from the ancient Greek word historia, which the LSJ defines as nerd break. Real quick nerd break. I just want to introduce y'all to the LSJ and the TLG. So the LSJ stands for the Liddell Scott Jones Greek English Lexicon. It's basically the definitive dictionary for Attic Greek, the dialect of ancient Greek that was spoken in the area of Athens. Now, you could probably find a physical copy of the LSJ at your local university library, but it's much easier to access it online through the TLG. The Thesaurus Linguae Graeciae is an online database that hosts searchable versions of the LSJ, the Cunliffe Lexicon of Homeric Greek, and other such dictionaries and lexicons. You can also use the text search function to search the entire TLG corpus for specific words. So, for instance, if you want to see every single instance of the word historia being used in an ancient Greek text, you can do that. The TLG will tell you exactly what author and what text the word appears in and where. Anyone who's ever taken an ancient Greek class has probably heard of the Perseus Digital Library. It's a website that allows you to look at an ancient Greek text online and then click on each individual word and see several possible definitions at once. The TLG also has this service, and I've been told it's usually more accurate than Perseus, but it's also more in-depth and thus overwhelming. So, pick your poison depending on what you need in the moment, but I just want to make sure everyone knows about these resources. They are free to use online. I think you just need to make an account to use the TLG. Anyway, the LSJ defines historia as potentially meaning an inquiry, the knowledge gained from such an inquiry, or the written account of the knowledge gained from an inquiry, so aka a narrative or a history. Historia is obviously where we get the English word history, right? But notice that this definition doesn't say anything about whether the narratives or knowledge gained from these inquiries is true. The idea of truth is something that pops up a lot in the Wonder Woman mythos. Her lasso compels people to tell the truth, of course. But on its first page, Historia acknowledges that there is no objective version of history. In the prologue, Historia presents itself sort of as an older Amazonian elder teaching a younger Amazon, presumably you, the reader, all about the Amazons' Historia, our story, which differs from the lies told by men. The narration thus frames the entire comic as relaying the true history of the Amazons, which has been intentionally erased by their enemies. Now, reimagining the origin of Wonder Woman and the history of the Amazons is really nothing new, but Historia's narrative is interesting in the way that it portrays the creation of the Amazons as being the Greek goddesses' response to misogyny in the ancient Mediterranean. So the comic begins with an invocation of the goddesses, right? Praising their beauty, their power, and their generosity to human women. This structure is obviously intended to parallel the way that ancient Greek poets begin their songs with praise of specific gods. So, for example, In the fifth Homeric hymn, one to Aphrodite, it starts by calling upon the muses to sort of speak through the poet and tell the audience all about the doings of Aphrodite rich in gold, the Cyprian goddess who sends sweet longing upon the gods and overcomes the peoples of mortal kind, and the birds that fly in heaven, and all the numerous creatures that the land and sea foster. All of them are concerned with the doings of fair garland Cytherea. After praising the goddesses, we get this scene of the subjugations and abuses of not men by men. Degradation, chattelry, exclusion, entitlement, occlusion, oppression, humiliation, subjugation, assault, murder, all illustrated on ancient Greek vases. Wherever a woman is represented suffering under these abuses, we don't actually see her face and body, just a silhouette in bright red. Now keep this illustration in the back of your mind because we're going to put a pin in this and come back to analyze it later. So after reflecting on these horrors, the goddesses gather on Olympus to petition Zeus, the king of the gods, on behalf of mortal women suffering under sexist oppression. Now the comic doesn't use words like sexism or misogyny or patriarchy directly, but as the goddesses face off against the male gods, Hera argues that the history of men is a chronicle of crimes against women. And she cites Herodotus, an ancient writer often hailed as the world's first historian, as documenting this plight. Now, Apollo tries to argue that men suffer too. There is honor in suffering, as if men and women suffer in equal proportion. But Zeus acknowledges that women do suffer, historically and undeniably, at the hands of men. But their world is not without justice. Zeus argues that each of us has a role to play, and he goes on to introduce each of the male gods and their spheres of influence. Then, speaking generally, Zeus says, an aggressive nature serves man well. From time to time, it drives him to overstep. And then there is retribution. For I am Zeus, god of sky, storm, order, and justice! Athena responds by asking, what is the purpose of man, father? What is the greater good so served by this violent nature? To which Zeus condescendingly replies, to exist, to live, to love, to eat, to shit, to people the world with his children, to look after them until time comes for them to look after him. I am genuinely sorry it is so hard for you to understand, my child, but nothing is without a reason. From this scene, we gather that the historical and undeniable suffering of women ultimately still fits within Zeus's understanding of a just world. As the god of justice, Zeus decrees that men are allowed to oppress women because this follows men's aggressive nature. When this aggressive nature drives men to overstep, which is a pretty loaded euphemism for all the acts of violence we saw illustrated a few pages earlier, but when this happens, then Zeus steps in and he punishes those arrogant, hubristic men. Of course, he won't do anything to protect women, like he won't prevent men from overstepping in the first place, but he'll gladly revel in the expression of his own power by smiting those rascally men after they've overstepped. What we're witnessing here is the articulation of a hierarchy. The conversation starts with Zeus addressing the status of women. He acknowledges that women, as a group, suffer at the hands of men. Now, in order for this to be true, women, as a group, must have less power collectively than men. If this weren't the case, like if men and women held equal collective power, then the violence between men and women wouldn't be so disproportionate. We would not have that scene with all the vases of violence against women. Then Zeus says each of us has a role to play, implying that each god, goddess, and human has a particular place which they occupy in his hierarchy. And then he ends with this demonstration of his own power, right? This huge burst of lightning as he declares himself the god of justice at the top. So this is what a just world looks like to Zeus, right? Here's his divine hierarchy. Okay, human women are at the bottom, with human men above them. Then, presumably, because he doesn't actually directly address them, but presumably then we have divine women, the goddesses, then divine men, the gods, and then finally he himself at the top. You know what we call a hierarchy that favors men and puts one man, one king, one father, one patriarch at the top? Patriarchy! Woo! Okay, so the narrative of Wonder Woman Historia has just established that the state of the ancient world is a state of patriarchy, a hierarchy with imbalances of power that run along gendered lines. And let's really focus in on that line about men's purpose being to exist. Zeus doesn't say anything about the purpose of women, but given the structure of the hierarchy that we just worked through, the implication of this scene is that women's purpose, their role, is to serve the existence of men. Once again, Zeus's justice does not address the oppression of women because women's suffering is not legible to him as an injustice. He just doesn't see it that way. To him, suffering in service of men is just women's role to play. Now, this is a kind of interesting exploration of the dynamics of power at play in the ancient Greek pantheon. Like, it's kind of cool to see this interrogation of Zeus's definition of justice. Though the art is pretty dense, let's say. Like, I suppose it's trying to convey the idea that, like, the divine realm of Olympus is beyond human comprehension, and that's why the architecture and even the bodies of the gods and goddesses themselves are so incomprehensible. Full disclosure, it took me several read-throughs to understand what the hell is going on in this scene, and even now I'm sort of like, so did Zeus try to smite Hermes with his lightning? Like, is that what was going on? And why did he need to be reminded what Hermes' name was? Like, that's his son. They're usually on pretty good terms. So to sum it all up, the Greek goddesses go to Olympus and they tell the Greek gods, hey, human women are suffering under misogyny. We need humans to stop doing misogyny. And the Greek gods, particularly Zeus, are like, nah, we also got misogyny. We're doing patriarchy here. So in response to the gods' commitment to patriarchy, the goddesses create the Amazons in secret as an act of rebellion. To do this, the goddesses travel to the underworld, to the Well of the Lost, where the souls of all women whose lives were taken in violence reside. It's a giant chamber where souls, these little bursts of light, are watched over by these giant hovering statues inspired by the many-breasted Artemis of Ephesus? Okay! Each goddess, except Hera, gives the Amazons some metaphysical gift, like Artemis offers this bone torn from my flesh. Once a cage for the heart, I set it free, and in doing so, I offer courage and liberty. The art here is pretty disconnected from any sense of ancient Greek art, but it is also pretty cool. Like, I can't deny that. I do feel like it conveys the idea of this cosmic transmutation of life and, again, the incomprehensibility of the divine pretty well. After gathering the souls to be reborn, the goddesses then bring the Amazons to life in different regions of the ancient Greek world, where they're organized into 6 tribes for 6 goddesses. At this point, the narrative cuts to Hippolyta, and it follows her perspective throughout the rest of the story, sort of following her journey as she transforms from a human woman to the immortal queen of the Amazons. Now, Wonder Woman Historia seems to evoke but also intervene on George Pérez's famous run of Wonder Woman comics from the late 1980s. In both, the Amazons are created from the souls of women who died violent deaths, and their brief stint living among mortals in ancient Greece is colored by the violence of slavery. Also in both DeConnick and Pérez's origin stories, the Amazons are relocated to the island of Themyscira as an eternal punishment by the gods, though the reason for this punishment differs. But before we talk more about that, time for a costume change! Ta-da! Okay, so to be more specific, in February 1987, DC published Wonder Woman #1, The Princess and the Power. In this issue, the Greek gods and goddesses are seen meeting on Mount Olympus to discuss how they can ensure their own survival through the eternal worship of humans. Artemis proposes the creation of a new race of female beings intended to set an example, to show man and woman's true place with each other as Gaia had meant it to be. This implies that something is off about ancient Greek society, right? That men and women are not acting in respect to their true place with each other, and this will somehow lead them to stop worshipping the gods. The comic never really explains what this means. Like, maybe we're meant to just already understand that there's vague, rampant sexism in the ancient world, and like, it seems like the gods are worried that this gender imbalance is gonna lead to conflict among humans, which will then cause humans to destroy themselves or forget about the gods. It's all very vague. I genuinely don't really know what he meant by this. Anyways, Ares is the only male god who actively objects to the creation of the Amazons. Like, Apollo and Hermes actually side with Artemis and Athena in this debate. But Ares thinks that humans can't be inspired to be better. They must be forced into eternal submission. Now, Zeus neither supports nor prevents the creation of the Amazons, and Hera similarly abdicates any involvement in the endeavor. So Hermes takes the goddesses down to the underworld, to the Wall of Rebirth, the Cavern of Souls, where they transmutate the souls of the women whose lives were cut short by man's fear and ignorance into the new race of the Amazons. But unlike in Historia, it's Hippolyte who is the firstborn of the Amazons, and the goddesses specifically tell her and her sisters that they are a chosen race, born to lead humanity in the ways of virtue, the way of Gaia. Through you, all men shall know us better and worship us always. Now, to fulfill this mission, the Amazons create a city-state named Themyscira, a place where compassion and justice reign, which pisses off the rival kings of Greece. So the kings of Greece coerce poets into maligning the Amazons and telling tales of Amazon atrocities, of murders, wars, and thievery, which turn the Amazons into outcasts, regarded by all mankind as different, strange, and even inhuman. On top of all this, Ares drives Heracles to attack and enslave the Amazons, a battle during which it is heavily implied that he also rapes Hippolyte. The Amazons do eventually free themselves, but they are punished by the goddesses for failing in their mission to lead humanity. As punishment, they are imprisoned on Paradise Island as jailers of an unspeakable evil which lies beneath the island. So, this is all pretty fucked up, right? Like, talk about victim blaming. When Athena appears to Hippolyte in chains, first she says, "No, you have not failed the goddesses of Olympus, you have only betrayed yourself. Once the Amazons dreamed of leading mankind, but you chose to withdraw from humanity, to ignore the purpose for which you were created, and you grew bitter and corrupt. Have you forgotten the source of your power? Have you forgotten the example you were to set?" Okay, so first off, nowhere does the comic establish that the Amazons chose to withdraw from humanity. Literally 8 pages earlier, the narration said that the Amazons were ostracized by human men for being compassionate and just. What? Where does the bitterness come from? Where's the corruption? Like, what? Second, after just literally telling Hippolyte, "No, you didn't fail us," like 3 pages later, Artemis says, "My daughters, you have failed us." What the hell, man? Like, what are we doing here? What's going on? Like, I understand inconsistencies can happen, like, issue from issue, but this is, like, the same issue. Where are the editors? Are they asleep at the wheel? Okay, inconsistencies aside, it's clear that Pérez is responding to various works of ancient Greek art that depict Amazonomachis, which literally means Amazon Wars. These were popular scenes for temple friezes, like one of the most famous examples is on the west metopes of the Parthenon in Athens, but it also appears as a popular scene on Greek vases. Now, scholars usually interpret these scenes as expressing Greek men's anxieties about women and foreigners, since Amazons are the ultimate embodiment of scary foreign women. They are the other. Woo! And the conflict with Heracles in particular is responding to the 9th labor of Heracles, where he steals the war belt, or girdle as it's often translated, of Hippolyta. Okay, so now that we've established what happens in Pérez's sort of canonical take on the origin of DC's Amazons, let's examine the 3 major changes that Historia makes to this narrative. So, first off, Hera is way more relevant to the narrative of the Amazons in Wonder Woman Historia. Reimagined here as a seer and as the goddess of women, not just the goddess of marriage, which is kind of wild, actually. Hera knows that the Amazons and the rebellion implied by their very existence is doomed to fail. So she manipulates the situation from behind the scenes to ensure the Amazons' survival and ultimately the birth of Wonder Woman herself. So these panels, for instance, show Hera watching over Hippolyta and setting her on the path to becoming the queen of the Amazons. The second intervention that Historia makes on the narrative of Pérez is its interest in real women. This happens on both the visual level, with greater representation of the physical diversity of women in regards to race and ethnicity, body type, and disability, but also at the narrative level, with Hippolyta's insistence that the Amazons allow regular human women to join their ranks. This somewhat addresses the problem of Amazonian exceptionalism that appears in the pages of Pérez. When Artemis here describes the sacred birthright of the Amazons as like supremely wise and just and loving, I believe the reader is meant to feel like this is a celebration of the inner power of women as a whole. But the text reminds us that Artemis is only speaking of her chosen race of Amazons. This celebration of womanhood does not actually apply to all women, only the exceptional ones created by the goddesses. Thus, it is significant that DeConnick reimagines Hippolyta as a human woman who starts her own tribe of Amazons made up of similarly human women. Unlike in Pérez, there's no single moment in Historia where the goddesses tell the Amazons, like, your mission is to go fight patriarchy. In fact, we never really get a clear explanation of why the goddesses created the Amazons. Like, it doesn't really seem like they had a plan. Instead, we see that the Amazons have taken it upon themselves to go hunt after caravans of enslavers, freeing enslaved women and then leaving them to their own devices before disappearing back into the shadows. However, Hippolyta rightly objects to this practice, arguing that this is not true freedom, as there is nowhere in this world of men for women to be free. After all, they could just be captured and enslaved again. They have no way of living in the world independently from men, and they have no way of ensuring the independence of their daughters. The only freedom imaginable to Hippolyta is to live separate from society with the Amazons. And so, the Amazons create a new tribe of formerly enslaved women with Hippolyta chosen as their queen. Now, the third intervention that Historia makes on the narrative of Pérez is focusing the purpose of the Amazons on the problems of misogyny rather than the problems of war. Like in Pérez, the creation of the Amazons stems from, again, I think, the Greek gods' fear that they will cease to exist if humans annihilate themselves through conflict. And the main antagonist of the story is Ares, the god of war, and the Amazons' mission is to lead humans by example towards peaceful lives of virtue. However, the Amazons end up ostracized from the male-dominated society of ancient Greece, and this failure leads them to be exiled to Paradise Island. Frankly, this is less of a failure on the part of the Amazons, and more a failure of the narrative to reckon with the fact that the Amazons have been given an impossible task. They have been set up to fail. It is precisely because of the misogyny of ancient Greek society that the Amazons cannot lead humans by example. Artemis briefly insinuates that the Amazons are supposed to teach humans the virtue of gender equality, I guess, right? Man and women's true place with each other. But how can this be achieved by a society that has no male Amazons to live in equality with? And how can this be achieved by a group of women who've been told that they are a chosen race, fundamentally superior to human men and women? So given all these issues with Pérez's text, I think Historia's attempt to more proactively address the problem of sexism in ancient Greece, rather than just treat it as like an obstacle on the way to a greater goal, I think that is an improvement. But while this narrative has the potential to be a really standout feminist comic book, it also has its problems. Even as Historia works to bring human women into the chosen race of the Amazons, like other Wonder Woman comics, it still struggles to pose an intersectional feminist critique of historical sexist oppression. Let's start by defining some key terms. So, in her 1984 treatise, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, Black radical feminist Bell Hooks defines feminism as the struggle to end sexist oppression. That means that feminism is necessarily a struggle to eradicate the ideology of domination that permeates Western culture on various levels. This includes the domination of certain genders over others, but also certain racial groups over others, certain economic classes over others, certain countries over others, and so on. Which is why Hooks also states that feminism is a commitment to reorganizing society so that the self-development of people can take precedence over imperialism, economic expansion, and material desires. This is an early articulation of what is now known as intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism is a type of feminism that specifically reckons with the ways that different systems of oppression like sexism, racism, capitalism, imperialism, queerphobia, ableism, and so on, they all intersect with one another, and they are all undergirded by a general ideology of domination and hierarchy. And how does this all relate to Wonder Woman Historia? Well, I believe Historia's narrative falls short of an intersectional feminist critique of patriarchy due to three factors. Number one, the antagonism of the sexes. First off, to give credit where credit is due, Historia does successfully convey the inherent injustice of a society, or in this case a cosmology, since we're dealing with both the human and the divine, but the injustice of a society or cosmology that is organized as a hierarchy. Specifically, a type of hierarchy known as patriarchy, because the highest position of power is occupied by a patriarch, Zeus, the father and king of the gods. And then the rest of the hierarchy is structured around gendered binaries, which favor men over women. But in the process of illustrating this hierarchy and its associated injustices, Historia sets up an inherent antagonism of the sexes. Historia frames the creation of the Amazons as the result of a conflict between all male gods and all female goddesses. Which to me, is just lazy reception, okay? If the Greek pantheon were really gonna duke it out over which gender they favor, I'm not convinced it would play out quite like this, okay? So yeah, it makes sense that like Artemis, Hera, and Demeter would all side with women, you know, like I guess there's mythic and there's cultic justification for that. I'm not arguing about those goddesses. And likewise, Zeus, Ares, Poseidon, and Apollo all siding with men, sure, okay, yeah, I'll buy it, that makes sense, right? Hestia is not really like a real goddess, so people just make up whatever the hell they want about her. Kind of same with Hecate, like she doesn't really have a huge presence in Greek literature, so, you know, I know people just make up whatever they want about her too. Oh, also, you may have noticed that I am just focusing on Greek myth and Greek portrayals of the gods and goddesses here, nothing Roman, okay? This comic specifically locates itself geographically and chronologically in ancient Greece. Anyway, Hermes, like, God, I don't know, man. Like, these gods all have competing agendas and alliances and, like, grudges against each other. And we do see those expressed in Greek myth and explored through poetry and art, but they don't tend to fall along rigid gender binaries like this. It's really Dionysus and Athena that I'm not convinced would side with their own gender, right? Like, Dionysus is easily the queerest of the gods by modern standards, and his primary followers are Maenads, who are women, right? Likewise with Athena, she is most proactive in the lives of male heroes, and scholars have often discussed how Athena possesses many masculine characteristics, and she could even be interpreted as like an androgynous divinity. And look, I'm not saying that Dionysus and Athena would never side with men or women respectively, I'm saying I need to be convinced, okay? You know, like, what's the reasoning here? Why would they do this? I need to be persuaded. Because in my mind, I'm already thinking that I think Dionysus might side with women and Athena would definitely side with men. Portraying the Greek gods and goddesses as neatly falling into this like man versus woman gender binary feels like you're not actually engaging with the source material, you're just contorting it to fit the story that you've already had in mind. Let's also not forget that those scenes where the goddesses argue with Zeus, they didn't just address the conflict between these divine characters as characters. No, they also spoke about the nature and the purpose of human men and women. Zeus makes claims about the inherent nature of men as aggressive and prone to acts of hubris or overstepping, as he calls it. And the goddesses have no counter-argument. As soon as Zeus starts talking about the nature of men, this is no longer a conversation about human, socially constructed hierarchies of power and, you know, the typical attitudes that are adopted by men and women based on their position in those hierarchies. No. Now, we are talking about inherent qualities and inherent imbalance of power between genders and inherent antagonism of the sexes. This way of understanding men and women reflects the rhetoric of certain groups of women's liberationists from what we now call the second wave of feminism in the 1960s to 1980s. In describing the ideology of these groups, Bell Hooks notes that fundamentally they argued that all men are the enemies of all women, and proposed as solutions to this problem a utopian woman nation, separatist communities, and even the subjugation and extermination of all men. Separatist communities of women living independently of all men. A utopian nation of women. Why does that sound so familiar? Intersectional feminism deliberately frames men and women as equal partners in the struggle to end sexist oppression, meaning that men share a responsibility to and an interest in feminism. I want to be clear that Bell Hooks is not the only intersectional feminist or black radical scholar that you should be reading. I just find her writing to be the most accessible, which is why you're gonna see me reference it and like recommend it a lot. Like, If you've ever felt like, oh, I'm not sexist, but I wouldn't call myself a feminist, or, I don't even know what feminism is. It seems so complicated. Where do I start? Please, just do yourself a favor, do the world a favor, pick up a copy of Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. I promise you it will be an easy read. Like, look at how thin this book is. It's tiny. Come on, you can do it. I believe in you. I believe in you. You can do it. Because inside Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, you will find some very insightful passages that will help you make sense of the world around you. Like this passage, for example. Here, Hooks is again describing the unproductive rhetoric of those women's liberationists from the 1960s and 70s and how they argued that all men were all-powerful, misogynist, oppressor, the enemy, whereas women were universally oppressed, the victims. Hooks pushes back against this rhetoric by pointing out that men do not share a common social status, that patriarchy does not negate the existence of class and race privilege or exploitation, and that all men do not benefit equally from sexism. In contrast, bourgeois white women, though often victimized by sexism, have more power and privilege as a result of their whiteness and their bourgeoisness, right? And thus are less likely to be exploited and oppressed than poor, uneducated, non-white males. Later, Hooks adds that men are not exploited or oppressed by sexism, but there are ways in which they suffer as a result of it. Men do oppress women. People, of all genders, are hurt by rigid sex role patterns. These two realities coexist. Essentially, Black radical feminists and intersectional feminists have spent the past several decades pushing back against this white feminist idea that the world can be understood as a simple antagonism of the sexes, where all men are oppressors and all women are oppressed, when reality, it's more complicated than that. Depending on where they fall in modern society's various intersecting hierarchies of race, class, sexuality, and ability, certain women are just as capable of oppressing others as men. Back to the comic book, Wonder Woman Historia's harsh divide between the loving, protective goddesses and the aggressive, oppressive gods does not reflect an intersectional feminist understanding of the world, nor does it reflect an ancient historical reality either. Because, as we've established, the Greek gods never aligned themselves along a gender binary like this in myth. In fact, many of the Greek goddesses are directly responsible for violence against human women, with Hera herself being one of the worst offenders. And the fact that not a single one of the mortal women who were freed by the Amazons, none of them express a desire to rejoin the men in their lives, whether that's family or friends or lovers, right? It's kind of disconnected from most women's lived experience. Most women would like to live alongside men as equals with equal human rights, rather than in some utopian nation of women like Themyscira or separatist communities of Amazons. Number 2, historical enslavement. The second factor I want to discuss is Historia's portrayal of historical enslavement in ancient Greece. Now, as the Amazons hunt after these caravans of enslavers, they somehow never encounter enslaved men. This is odd because as far as scholars are able to reconstruct based on archaeological and literary evidence, men were enslaved in equal, if perhaps not greater, numbers to women in ancient Greece. My guess is that DeConnick is working off the idea that ancient slaves come from warfare. You know how, in the Trojan War, the men of Troy are all slaughtered and the women of Troy are all taken as slaves. You can read about this in Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, that attests to this phenomenon. Or for a more historical example, Thucydides, another ancient historian, tells of the Athenians sacking the island of Milos, killing all the men and enslaving all the women and children. But as Peter Hunt discusses in Ancient Greek and Roman slavery, this did not actually happen that often. If anything, we have more literary and artistic evidence for enslaved men than enslaved women. For example, in his book, Hunt discusses a particular piece of archaeological evidence for the slave population in Athens called the Attic Stelae. These were a set of lists inscribed on stone outlining the property confiscated from a number of wealthy Athenians who were condemned for sacrilege in 415 BCE. And these lists record 37 male slaves to only 9 female slaves. What's more, we find predominantly male slaves in Greek comedy, even though most comedies were set in the household where we would expect female slaves to predominate among domestic slaves. If you want to learn more about ancient slavery, I recommend not only Peter Hunt's 2017 book that we've been discussing so far, but also Sarah Forsdyke's 2021 book, Slaves and Slavery in Ancient Greece. In both of these academic texts, you'll find that slavery is an institution that affects both women and men. Frankly, it's really hard to get any kind of concrete sense of just how many men or women were enslaved in ancient Greece. Like, this is fundamentally a subaltern group, and it's difficult to study them both in the literary and the archaeological record. But what I'm trying to say with all this is that there's no historically accurate reason for Wonder Woman Historia to only portray enslaved women, when in reality, women and men were enslaved alongside each other. It's also notable to me that Historia does not reckon with the fact that many enslavers were also women. Like, sure, it probably wasn't women who were like out there collecting war captives or pressing people into debt bondage, but ancient literary and mythical evidence do point towards women owning slaves. Like in Homer's Odyssey, for example, it's Penelope who is responsible for managing the household slaves. When Odysseus returns to Ithaca, it's the female slave Eurycleia who rats out the other enslaved women as like fraternizing with the suitors. When Odysseus decides to kill these enslaved women, Athena does not step in and save these women from like violence at the hands of her favorite male hero, nor does she even criticize Odysseus for his actions. The killing of the slave women is like honestly a really gruesome scene, and the main reason why I put off listening to Epic the Musical for so long. Like, I'm just really ambivalent about this Odysseus guy, okay? This is all to show that, again, the historical realities of misogyny are not as cut and dry as Historia suggests. Ancient Greek myth testifies to violence against women being carried out by women, both human and divine. Furthermore, the comic does not acknowledge how poor, disabled, and queer men also suffered marginalization in ancient Greece, with foreign men particularly bearing the brunt of the institution of slavery. Nor does the comic address how women participated in these systems of oppression. By pretending that only women were enslaved in ancient Greece, Historia grants women negative exceptionalism. It portrays women as like uniquely and universally and thus more exceptionally oppressed in ancient Greece. Number 3, the fetishization of queenship. This brings us to the final critique I have of Wonder Woman Historia. It's fetishization of queenship and hierarchical power. The leader of each Amazonian tribe is not called a leader. She's called a queen. Hippolyta's origin as the Queen of the Amazons is the whole purpose for this comic. And while each book takes the time to invoke and praise each of the goddesses who created the Amazons, only Hera, Queen Hera, gets these full double-page spreads all to herself. Now, I feel it needs to be said that monarchy is antithetical to the goals of feminism, as it is yet another manifestation of the ideology of domination that permeates Western culture. After all, monarchy relies on dispossessing people of their political and economic power and reallocating it within the hands of a single monarch or ruling family. Through the use of force, by the way. Monarchy is a system that is inherently unjust and requires the dispensation of violence in order to maintain itself. So there can be no intersectional feminist critique of enslavement and patriarchy while glorifying queenship. After all, monarchy and patriarchy are inextricable from each other, okay? They're like this. This is something that Historia itself illustrates. It's Zeus's absolute power, his ability to dominate divinities and humans alike and force them into a hierarchy of his own making, with him at the top as king and patriarch. That is what creates the conditions of misogyny that the goddesses and the Amazons are rebelling against in the first place. Queenship does not challenge sexist oppression. It merely assimilates some women into existing power structures. It makes some women powerful, like the queen and female members of the ruling family, but does not distribute power equally to all women. And while Historia does labor to imagine a kind of queenship that's consensual, right, with Hippolyta being chosen by the recently emancipated Amazon women, This is undermined by the Amazons' continued reverence for Hera, okay? Like, Hera's rule over human women is not consensual, it's manipulative. At the climax of Historia, the Amazons have all been wiped out by Zeus, and only Hippolyta remains. Artemis grants her an audience with the gods. I'm not sure why, maybe as some kind of last Hail Mary, but when Hippolyta arrives on Mount Olympus, she does not find the goddesses standing at her side in opposition of Zeus. No, they stand with the gods, visually united against Hippolyta, the human. Hera then manipulates Hippolyta into trading the Amazons' freedom for their lives, and the defeated Amazons are all reborn on Themyscira as the eternal prisoners of Apollo. Like, the eternal slaves of Apollo, basically. But why don't the goddesses unite with the Amazons in war against the gods? Why don't the goddesses risk their lives to help the women that they supposedly love so much? The implication of this scene is that the goddesses are only willing to help human women so long as it does not threaten their position within Zeus's divine hierarchy. Which brings us back to the question, why did the goddesses create the Amazons in the first place? Like, we know it has something to do with misogyny, they're upset about misogyny, but by failing to articulate an actual purpose for the Amazons, like a reason for their creation, a goal for them to achieve, a plan for them to carry out, the goddesses fail to articulate an ideological response to Zeus and the misogyny of men. The goddesses reject the patriarchy constructed by Zeus, but only to the extent that they express their distaste for it. They don't challenge the male gods directly. They don't try to argue for some alternative way of organizing the world and understanding human nature. By turning away from direct conflict and then displacing the responsibility for supporting human women onto the Amazons, the goddesses actually accept Zeus's patriarchy. They accept that this is the way of the world, and they're just basically lashing out by creating the Amazons without having an actual plan for how the Amazons are going to challenge and overcome patriarchy and, create a newer and better way of organizing the world. The goddesses are not really pursuing any kind of revolution. They're just grasping at some kind of control, some expression of their own power. Honestly, I see the birth of the Amazons as quite similar to the way Zeus has his little lightning outburst on Olympus, right? Like, both actions are just expressions of power that aren't directed at anything. They serve no purpose other than to make the person performing the action feel powerful. Wonder Woman Historia could have concluded in this really powerful way by critiquing the goddesses themselves, like pointing out how they, like other real women, participate in sexist oppression for the sake of their own empowerment. But instead, Hippolyta does directly call out the gods and goddesses for their cruelty and manipulation to their faces, but for some reason, the story still ends with the Amazons, like, embracing the goddesses as their loving patron divinities. I just don't get it. Like, what happened here? Why, after everything that they've gone through, why do the Amazons still treat the goddesses this way? After everything Hippolyta went through, like, this ending just, it boggles my mind. I feel like this is the world's greatest feminism fumble. I don't get it. What happened here? What happened? Concluding thoughts. Wonder Woman Historia's sort of oversimplification of the gender dynamics of sexist oppression and its ahistorical representation of enslavement speak to a general decontextualization of misogyny and mythology from the historical realities of ancient Greece. As we've established, as a piece of media that engages with the art and culture of the ancient Mediterranean, Wonder Woman Historia is a work of classical reception, which, unfortunately, shares classical reception's tendency to seemingly forget that ancient Greece was a real historical place that has a modern descendant culture. This tendency leads creatives to engage in various historical inaccuracies, which belie a general, though I'm sure unintentional, but nonetheless a sort of disrespect towards historical Greek culture. For example, why does Historia not use actual Greek letters to spell out Wonder Woman's name at the end of Book 3? One might argue, oh, maybe this is somehow easier for like an English-speaking audience to read. Maybe that's why they're using these sort of like goofy made-up letters. But this is how Diana would be spelled in actual Greek. What's going on here? Okay, so this panel reveals a desire to sensationalize the Greek language, which in turn implies a certain disregard for the language as it is. Let's also backtrack to that big splash page illustration of all the crimes against women being illustrated on those Greek vases. Remember, I told you to put a pin into it. We're coming back to it now. Okay, so by using Greek vases to depict these crimes, Historia takes on an air of authenticity. Think about it. If Phil Jimenez had just drawn some random scenes of random women being assaulted, it might not hit as hard as seeing those same scenes on a Greek vase. The vase, as a framing device, gives a sense that this actually happened. It's a piece of historical art, so it gives the sense that these are real historical occurrences, right? Not just something a modern artist made up. And if you didn't know any better, you might think that every single Greek vase we see illustrated in this comic represents or corresponds to an actual vase that exists out there somewhere in a museum. Spoiler alert, that's not true at all, but seeing all of them collected together gives this oppressive sense of the scale of ancient violence against women. Like, in these two splash pages, Historia borrows the credibility and the prestige of ancient vase painting to produce an emotional response to the scope of historical misogyny. And you know, I actually kind of like this idea. I like where they were going with this way of representing, again, the scope, the magnitude, the horror of historical misogyny. But the problem for me, as someone with a background in classical art and archaeology, is that none of these vases actually exist, right? These are not real Greek vases. You might think they look like Greek vases, you know, they have the right colors and the right style, right? Well, sorta. Okay, so the black and orange color scheme is evocative of both Attic red figure pottery and South Italian pottery from, the 6th to 4th centuries BCE. But the colors and the composition aren't quite right. All right, so first off, we don't usually see 2 shades of orange on a single pot. Like, there's usually the orange of the clay, and then maybe potentially some added white or some other colors, just, on the surface, small details, minor details, that's about it. It wouldn't usually make up the background like this. There's a type of pot called like a white ground, but then there wouldn't be any orange. Basically, the orange and the white, those are supposed to be representing the actual color of the clay. The black that you see is a result of the firing technique. There are plenty of videos. I can link some in the description explaining how this process works, like how do you make ancient Greek vases? Where do the orange and the black come from? Also, the shape of the vessels is a little off. Like, what is this shape? I don't even know what the hell this thing is. And it's not like all of these vases are incorrectly shaped. It's just that there's enough of the little details being off that it's very jarring for someone with a background in ancient art history, right? Like, where are the handles? These are shaped like amphora, but where are the handles? It's so close and yet just a little bit off, and why? Anyway, what really matters is the iconography, okay? The images being depicted on the vases. Because yes, these things did happen to ancient women. We have artistic, literary, and archaeological evidence that attests to women being enslaved, assaulted, violently murdered, and excluded from democratic processes, like voting. But that evidence doesn't usually come from vases like this. First off, slaves are never shown in chains, okay? It's actually really hard to tell who's a slave and who's a servant or who's just a young family member in ancient Greek art. The Greeks did not want to visually represent the injustice of slavery, even though they knew it existed, but they have a very paternalistic way of depicting and discussing slaves and enslavement in their art and literature. We also never see sexual assault actually happening in Greek vases like this. At most, you might have what's called a pursuit scene, where a male figure chases after a female figure, and it's sort of implied that he might be about to rape her. Now, don't get me wrong, violence against women does appear on Greek vases, but only in sort of exceptional cases, like in this vase with Artemis and Apollo killing the children of Niobe, or in this vase where Achilles kills the Amazon Penthesilea. Honestly, women don't usually appear in combat scenes unless they're Amazons, in which case they're treated as fellow warriors. It's actually really weird to me to see this very famous composition of Achilles and Penthesilea mirrored in this small container. But here, Penthesilea is no longer dressed in armor, and she's posed like she's going down without a fight. Like, it looks like her back is turned and her head is hung, like Achilles is killing her in cold blood. But the actual ancient vase implies that Achilles and Penthesilea met as equals on the battlefield. And yet here, the modern illustration portrays this mystery woman. I mean, you can't even really say it's Penthesilea at this point, but they're portraying her as merely a victim. Again, to the artist's credit, like, a lot of the vases in this splash page do seem inspired by actual scenes from Greek mythology. But again, there's always something like a little off. Like, this scene seems to allude to the Greeks killing Hector and Andromache's infant child, Astyanax, during the end of the Trojan War, right? But Astyanax was a boy, so I don't know why he's a girl here. And then some of these scenes are just complete fabrications, okay? So who the hell is getting burned alive right here? There were no witch hunts in ancient Greece. I don't know why. The human furniture scene? I mean, I guess this could have happened, but there are no stories or art depicting something like this from ancient Greece, so it's kind of like, why go there? Like, if you really want a scene of violence against women happening on a Greek vase, the sacrifice of Polyxena is right there. Also, this overhead angle of Hercules, like, standing over this woman, that's crazy. A Greek vase with an overhead POV? What? Unheard of. Truly unheard of. It's like Classics 101. All the vases are like in profile. If you have a frontal face and a Greek vase, that's weird, okay? It's like weird to the point of like the artist must have intended something by this. Can you imagine? If we found a vase that had an overhead POV, people would think it was a fake, and it is. It is a fake. It's fake. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't based on anything. Okay. I say all this not to be pretentious, I promise, but to explain why I think it's a missed opportunity for Wonder Woman Historia to invent images of ancient misogyny to get mad at, instead of interrogating how misogyny actually manifested in ancient Greece. Like, why are these pursuit scenes so common on ancient Greek men's drinking wear? Like, why do they seem so playful instead of disturbing? Why is Polyxena being sacrificed on this amphora? Why is Artemis so enthusiastic about killing the daughters of Niobe? It's interesting how the comic blots out the figures of women in red ink to sort of imply that their stories are invisible, lost to history, right? Like, the lives of these women are undervalued and their suffering is uncared for. But the truth is, ancient Greek women are somewhat invisible in the artistic record. It is inventing vases with women on them just to blot out the women, to make a point about women being invisible. But you could have just illustrated some actual Greek vases that don't have any women on them and then talked about how messed up it is that there are no women on them. Or if there are women present, you can talk about how those women are actually represented. Like, I promise you, real Greek art does attest to real ancient misogyny. It's just not as obvious, right? It's more subtle. And because it's subtle, that's why I think it needs to be interrogated. It needs to be discussed. Now, I do understand that comic artists are under a lot of pressure to get things done really fast, and that they're very underpaid and underappreciated as artists in general, and I do not mean to be punching down on the artist who made this illustration, okay? But at the same time, I feel like we're witnessing a kind of visual manifestation of the same impulse to oversimplify the historical realities of misogyny that resulted in Historia's narrative, like, undermining its own feminist aspirations. It's still worth it to analyze and critique the way people act under pressure, because the text is still out there. The text is there. I'm critiquing the text. I'm not complaining about the artist, okay? Like, Phil Jimenez, if you watch this, I'm not a hater. And while I don't think this is intentional, I do think the comic reflects a desire to aggrandize ancient Greek art, right? As if Greek vase painting, like the Greek language, like we saw earlier, right? As if these things are not worth engaging with on their own terms, as they actually are, as they actually exist in the world. Both of these tendencies speak to a decontextualizing, right, of ancient Greek cultural production, Greek myth, Greek art, from its specific historical moment. It's like they're borrowing the aesthetics without any of the substance. As a final parting thought, yes, Wonder Woman comics are all works of fantasy, and they are allowed to take some artistic liberties and create their own fantastical worlds. But from the outset, Historia frames itself as a work of historical fiction that takes the real-world location and time period of ancient Greece as its setting, and the real-world oppression of women as its subject. Ultimately, I think Wonder Woman Historia is a missed opportunity to interrogate how misogyny manifested in actual aspects of ancient Greek culture. Like, the negative exceptionalism that's afforded to women in Historia distracts from the reality that patriarchy was not, and is not today, distinct from other systems of oppression. I really hope that in the future, Wonder Woman comics will more boldly embrace an intersectional feminist critique of structural power, and not just borrow the aesthetics of feminism or the aesthetics of ancient Greece. Thank you so much for watching. This video essay actually started as a conference presentation that I delivered at the Comic Arts Conference at WonderCon in 2024. If you're interested in learning more about the Comic Arts Conference, I highly recommend being there as both an attendee and a presenter. I'm going to put a link in the description below to their website so you can learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I have just started this YouTube channel. I'm going to be talking about all sorts of instances of classical reception. Again, classical reception is the reimagining or the reproduction, the retelling of ancient Mediterranean myth and art and culture more broadly. So if you liked this video, I'll have many more coming. I'm going to try to post once a month. You can also follow me on my various social media channels where I'm going to post updates as videos come out, and then also probably more cosplay pictures. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the video. And she cites Herodotus, an ancient writer often hailed as the world's first whore.